Hello everyone. So from a blue period to a rose period, here Picasso's taken his next step in abstracting the object, which is here in this case the person, Gertrude Stein. So what was happening in the blue period and the rose period is really Picasso kind of exploring his education and newfound possibilities. In the symbolist influenced blue period, you don't have so much a flattening of shapes, a flattening of space, but more, trying to paint someone but make it sad. Here, we have the warmth of Gertrude Stein. You have the warm colors, but you have the beginnings of cubism and the flattening of shapes. And, here we understand that she's looking one way, but we're looking directly at our eyes here, kind of like the Egyptians and the Greeks. We see also that he has paid special attention to keeping everything very simple with those brushstrokes and larger shapes, which is really a kind of a nod to, or rather, something that Cezanne was doing. For example, the book will talk about the flattening of the hand into one simple flesh-colored shape. I'd like to direct you to the ear. You understand that it has those little folds and indentions, but in this case, it's been reduced to a flat tan shape. This is the first piece of the chapter for this, and really kind of shows the seeds of where Picasso is going to start abstracting space. And we go from this to a very extreme difference with Cubism really developed here in the women of Avignon. You can see the influence in primitivism, the fact that he has simply copied, in one case, a tribal mask. He here has broken down not just the body, but lights and darks, shadows and highlights, in to very simple shapes. You can see that in the fabric backdrop and parts of the body. And, some of what he's doing is actually similar to what's happening with Matisse as well. This could be cut paper, but rather it is painted. Now, some people have a hard time understanding this figure, so I want to explain it. A woman is sitting on, a bench. We see the back of the woman. We see the buttocks and the hips. She has her elbow on her knee and hand on her thigh on the other side, and she's simply looking over her shoulder, but here it has been, exaggerated to where she is looking directly at us. Up top, you can see the tribal mask and see another face. Perhaps it's another mask, or perhaps it's an allusion to the shadow. Perhaps she's simply trying to shade the face. The two women in the center are in the light. These women are in shadow, or perhaps their faces are literally darker, or simply he's trying to, bring in more of the tribal influence. Again, you can see that parts of the face are turned, but he's presenting the idea. He's presenting that full front view. And so that's what's going to lead us to perhaps the most famous type of cubism that he's known for, and not just Picasso, but George Braque, analytic cubism. Analytic cubism, think about it like a science experiment, or Impressionism compared to Post-Impressionism. We're trying to understand the world around us through a very, not scientific view, but rather a very different view. They're more concerned with representing something through this new filter, through this new way of thinking. If you look at a person, that's not their only side. A person has many sides. Obviously, the violin has many sides. Well, it has four at least, obviously. But here, Braque and Picasso are trying to show that all of the multiple sides can be seen at once. For example, the side of the neck of the violin, or the side of the head of the violin is shown here, whereas the front of the violin is shown here, but here you can see the bottom and the little piece here in the bottom. You can see the different elements of it kind of mixed and mashed together. For those that sometimes people don't see it, so I want to point out, you can see the picture, the rim of the picture is here, the neck, the handle, and the body. The body of the picture is there. So Picasso kind of plays around the flattening of shape. He pushes that to an even larger extent. You can see that he's still trying to show lights and darks. He's trying to explore that filter, which is cubism. And then he kind of, pushes it to the extreme with analytic cubism. Now, perhaps he made this in his studio, perhaps he, meant for this to be some grand transition, but one of his works that we talk about here is collage, and collage is a transition between analytic to synthetic. He's further breaking down shapes and simplifying things. The eye is no longer an oval, but simply a dot. The nose broken down to simply a line. We understand the line there is the nose, and he's presenting us the front of the ear, rather the side of the ear. Anyway, instead of the front, but rather the side. That's what I meant to say. We have the multiple viewpoints in that the hat here is shown in one angle, but the hat is shown here in another, the top of the head, the side of the head, and here, the extreme shadow, the shaded face. The interesting thing, though, is collage. In the previous chapter, we saw decoupage. Matisse was cutting out colored pieces of paper. Picasso does that here, but he goes a step further. He takes newspaper which we normally think of as black and white. You can read it in black and white. I mean, that's not part of it, but when you look at that black and white from a distance, think about what Seurat was doing with pointillism. If you put yellow next to blue, you make green. Well, in this case, black and white from a distance look gray. It looks like a texture. It could be writing, it could simply be scribbles. And so he has used that newspaper to create shadows on the face. This is mind-blowing for some. So that means that I can just use newspaper and some wrapping paper and I can make art? The answer is yes. And that's even made more apparent in assemblage. The found objects of the bicycle seat and the handlebar come together here to form a bull's head because, essentially a face is, dots, triangles, very simple shapes that we identify. He's taken that idea of simplified shapes to represent the symbols of what we know and used that to create a bull's head. So it is clearly an influence of the cubism, the simplification of shapes, and it's also saying that if I can take wrapping paper and use that in a collage, then I can do the same with sculpture. I can take objects that I don't normally think of as being related to sculpture and the grand academic tradition of sculpture and make a new thing. I can represent those things under the light of art and it is valid. Well, that's pretty revolutionary. Meanwhile, back on the canvas, analytic cubism has gone through the science experiment and Picasso has moved on. He wants to actually say something. He wants to explore emotions and have more than just a filtered view. He explores, he expresses, he explores, he expresses, and he has really began to understand the expressive capabilities of cubism. So from analytic to synthetic, he's not so concerned with stressing the multiple viewpoints, but he's using multiple viewpoints and color, and those two together make the synthetic cubism. The beard here is a simple pattern. We could translate that to newspaper, perhaps, because it looks a little like that newspaper there. In case you don't understand, there's one musician here, there's his face, his legs, there's a second musician in a harlequin uniform, or costume, with his mouth, his eyes. Maybe his mouth is wide open there because he's singing. It's hard to say, but here's part of his face, here's another part. I'd like to think that he's singing, or maybe his head is turning and Picasso's captured at mid-turn. And then behind him, or rather beside him, is a person either holding music or making music with something like an accordion. I think probably he's simply holding the music, but the title of the work is Three Musicians. So, what kind of instrument is he using, or is he singing? That's worth something thinking about, but you're not going to be tested on it. So synthetic cubism is leading to leading to a desire to express, and we see that expression here in Girl Before a Mirror. And this is really a profound piece because it's more than just that filtered view that is expressive, but it presents lots of questions for interpretation. It is a psychological portrait as much as a portrait of a young woman. When you look at this, you can see many different interpretations. The woman she has a light side. She has more of what we could think of or imagine as a normal colored side. Here, we see that her body has been broken down into simple geometric shapes or semi-geometric shapes. Then we have her reflection, which is true. Looking at the mirror, her face is violet, red, green. Some of these colors are the exact opposite of what's being used here. Green is the opposite of red, here in this case pink, and violet is the diametric opposite of yellow. We see differences in the body. Here the breasts are smaller, the belly not so pronounced, the body a distinctly different shape. So is this a woman who's looking at her body? Does she want to be thinner? Does she want to be, does she want to be something that she's not? Or is this the woman and how she really is? Which is the real woman and which is, the truth? Is this even about memories? Another question to consider. Perhaps the woman is pregnant and she's simply thinking about, life before pregnancy, or perhaps she's thinking about life after pregnancy. What Picasso's done here, with color and with this new filter that is cubism, he's explored the possibility of how to put that filter on different things, but now he's actually expressing things. He has attacked the tradition of beauty in the women of Avignon. He explores that to a further extent here with Girl Before a Mirror. There are many, many works of Picasso's that we could discuss. In fact, we could probably spend an entire week talking about Picasso, in that he has his academic training, he develops Cubism, and then he reinterprets his education through the lens of Cubism. There's, what do we think of when we think of the equestrian portrait? Strong, proud man on top of a horse. Well, later on, Picasso would paint boy leading a horse. The man does not need to be on top of the horse to control it. He simply stands in front of it. I would encourage you to look at Boy Leading a Horse, and look at many of his works to see the progression, and you can see if you look close enough, you can see the changing mind of a man. And then, all of this is leading up to his absolute greatest work. 90% of all historians that look at Picasso will tell you that this is his greatest work. For many, this was the video of the falling man. This was a young girl running down the street that was on fire, naked. This was the Rodney King beating and so many other things. Guernica was a simple village in Spain, and in the middle of the night, it was bombed, just destroyed. Why? Because the Nazis wanted to see how they could do. It was a bombing run, a test mission. Later, the leader of the squadron was quoted as, and I'm paraphrasing here, he simply said, "It was an absolute amazing run. We couldn't ask for better conditions. Every bomb hit its mark. We're quite proud." And he goes on to extol the virtues of his co-pilot, his pilots that worked under him, about how efficient and how accurate and how deadly their bombing mission turned out. This town, this village, had no strategic value, had no luxury resources at all. It was a simple farming village. And also the victim of a bombing test mission. Why bomb on dead targets? We can vote on live and see what really happens. Obviously, this was a tragedy, and not many people heard about it until it was released in the press. Picasso, living in Paris, read about this, was outraged, shocked, because Picasso was a Spaniard, and more than just nationality, his personality, his philosophy, Spanish to the core. He's considered by many to be the greatest artist since Goya. The artists that come from Spain. And like Goya, he steps up to the challenge to document or to depict this horrible tragedy. Following his background, his upbringing, and his roots, he sticks to the religious influence. He shows this tragedy in 3 parts, like a triptych, and it seems to be completely full of doom and gloom. He has even put himself into the image. As the light comes through, as people flee or have fallen, Picasso stands there simply witnessing. You can see the influence of the religious artwork from the Renaissance and from the Christian tradition here with something akin to the Pietà. The Mother Mary, like this massive mountain of a woman, seems to hold the fallen Christ. Here, a woman mourns the death of her baby, her head up, her tongue a sharp dagger, accentuating the scream issuing from her mouth, a scream from the horse as it is gouged, as it is fallen. The baby already fallen, Picasso here shows himself as a bull. Picasso would insert himself or show himself many times as either a minotaur or a bull. The bull, again, as we've seen for the last 4,000 years, is a symbol of power, a symbol of strength, virility, a strong sexual animal. He has taken the time to show the testicles of the bull, the horns of the bull, and the strong nature, the pose of the bull. And the bull screams out, but it's really rather ineffectual in this case. He simply bears witness and seems to be screaming in horror at the revelation of seeing this. Meanwhile, on the right side, the triangle takes a different shape as a person in a fallen building screams out for help. Their screams are silent, though, as their dagger-like tongue is missing. We see glimpses of other people through different windows and buildings, and in the middle, in this kind of larger middle triangle, in this middle section, is the light of truth, the light of knowledge, or the light screaming in. People injured, running for their life, a soldier fallen in the same pose as that in 3rd of May. That hands up, don't shoot, arms spread apart like Christ on the cross. But now we have an added element, that is the stigmata. Here we see the familiar wound, or maybe not familiar wound, of Christ and his crucifixion. The wounds through the hands. This person shown broken like a sculpture, now broken upon the ground, holding his broken sword. Which leads us to the only symbol of hope or warmth at all in the painting, the flower. Originally, Picasso had painted a Pegasus flying from the open, gaping wound of the horse. The horse, whose texture is very, very similar to that newspaper texture that we see in one of his earlier works. The texture of the newspaper here, kind of continuing here, and then here. That's no coincidence. This is by design. Above it all, though, is not the light of the Lord which we usually associate with being above the world of man, but here we have the lone bulb looking like an eye down and judging us. That is the light of the interrogator's room. It is cold, it is emotionless, and it is stark. Picasso comes full circle here with his education. He paints beauty, he paints the historical painting, he paints expressively, he paints scientifically, and now he stands up to the test and gives us his greatest work, which was so profound its influence is lasting still. In fact, in the 90s, the United Nations owned or had Guernica in its building, and the UN was about to give a press conference on Bosnia-Herzegovina, Bosnia, Serbia, the entire conflict in the 90s. So someone in their press corps decided to hold a press release in front of this beautiful Picasso. Thinking about the history of Guernica, a person in the press said, "So are you saying that the American presence in Bosnia or Serbia is akin to the Nazis and what's happening here? Is there a connection?" Obviously, the person in charge of that person that decided where that press conference was sacked. They covered the painting and moved the press conference elsewhere. Images have power. Daumier knew that. Picasso knew that. And this painting would go on to represent Paris at the World Expo, to represent Spain at the World Expo. So is this the only ism in the chapter? Of course not. So in France, you have the prevailing influence of Cubism. Over in Germany and Russia, you have Expressionism. In Italy, you have Futurism. Think about all the changes that were happening. You have radio, the car, flight, greater engines, bigger things, bigger, mass production of things, assembly lines like nothing before, seeming to show that our limits are limitless. Futurism attempted to show that boundless momentum in art. Here, the sculpture seems to be jumping out of those blocks. There is not a single part of the sculpture that is still. Everything seems to be moving and moving forward, like the wind is catching the legs of the wind is catching the fabric of the pants and just whipping about. Futurism sought to combine the limitless expectations or imaginings of industry with the future, breaking away from the academic or classical tradition. Abstraction has now hit sculpture in a brand new way, very different from the post-impressionism of Rodin. Meanwhile, Cubism is permeating different elements. We have The City by Leger. Here, it's not just shape and something close up, but now we have landscape through the Cubist lens. And really, you can see a strong influence of Cubism here. One might think that this is Cubist, but it kind of falls under the futurist label because of industry, the connection, the movement of it all. And then we have, again, another non-representational work. If you were in class, I would be playing, if we were having this lecture in class, I would be playing an example of the boogie-woogie style. Boogie-woogie is a fast style of music, most commonly thought of with piano playing. And if you're a big fan of Bugs Bunny, then you know boogie-woogie from Bugs Bunny cartoons. Broadway boogie-woogie attempts to capture the sense, the feeling of boogie-woogie, and combine it with that which is Broadway, New York City. Now, think about it. Broadway, New York City is busy, chaotic, bright, intense, and this work could be either a subway map, a street map, or it could be a traffic map. The hard stops, the corners, the higher traffic, the less traffic. Here he balances it all out with geometric precision and clockwork-like organization. The primary colors of red, yellow, and blue work with the white to create something that, well, bounces around like the boogie-woogie style. So now our attention focuses from Paris, from the modernists, from the classical traditions, to New York. The art of the new. In this work, Nude Descending a Staircase, Marcel Duchamp, an artist, our second artist that has transcended multiple chapters, has shown us something very akin to the sculpture by Boccioni. You have the movement, you have nothing that is still, but you have also kind of a cubist view of that boundless motion. Now, for people that don't understand it, it is a naked woman descending a staircase. Okay, let's go back here. I'd like to try and explain how this is a nude, or how this is a woman. We'll start first with the legs. Here's the bottom part of the leg, here, here, and here. The staircase is shown here, coming down that way. And to a lesser extent, one might say that this is leg, one might say that this is staircase. But there is a progression going up and down, or across and down, across and down, across and down here. Moving up from the calves to the thighs, we have the thigh here, here, we have the hips, and then we have the torso, the breasts, and the head. Looking here, you could see the arm kind of sticking out. Perhaps their arm is on their hip. I say perhaps, because ultimately I'm not Duchamp. I don't know for a fact which part is which, but many people see that as the nude. Obviously, as she's coming down, there's one layer on top of another as she descends the staircase. And here we have a flat-out rejection of this work. Duchamp's work was rejected flat out as not being art, being so far removed from slightly recognizable form. At least in the Futurists, you could understand what was there. You could understand what was there most of the time with Cubism as well. But by blending those together in this fashion, Duchamp has, taken what they have done with opening the previous door for abstraction and kicked it open even further. Meanwhile, there is a little thing called the Harlem Renaissance and what is known as Harlem. Harlem Renaissance being a renaissance of not just visual art, but all of the fine arts, theater, music. In this large painting, this mural, we see black culture or African American culture moving from the cotton field to the cotton club. And make no mistake, do not dismiss the influence of black American culture in the United States, especially at this time, because it is the invention of jazz, the development from the blues, and from those traditions of music that we have our popular music now. Ask anyone who their influences were, and you can trace it back to some artist that ultimately is traced back to here. Country music can be traced back to other cultures, but even some country music artists will trace their influences back to the Harlem Renaissance. We don't have enough time to talk about every work, every image in this chapter. This is our last painting. From here, we'll move on to architecture. Obviously, Kazimir Malevich's work is pretty controversial. He's known as the artist that has black on black or white on white. The suprematist does not observe and does not touch, he feels. So suprematism is one of those final isms. It's not as profound or avant-garde as the others, but it does deserve attention. Futurism is also captured in the work of Brancusi, and I would encourage you to look at Brancusi's sculpture. The brass bird, that's not the title of it, but many people remember it as such. We move from here to architecture. And notice that we're looking at more Americans here. Frank Lloyd Wright has taken that Cubist nod and applied it in a slight way to his own work. But Cubism is not natural. Cubism is a filter through which we can see the world. Frank Lloyd Wright seeks to, in some ways, combine nature with Cubism. We have that here in Falling Water. The geometric shapes are referencing nature, but stand out against it as well. By combining the bricks, the natural stone, with the unnatural concrete, he's created a strong contrast that's beautiful and conspicuous at the same time, but inconspicuous in other ways. These bricks kind of repeat the texture of nature around it, whereas these repeat the stones that jut out but are clearly man-made. The hint of color, very similar to the hints of color that one may see throughout the woods, whether it's red or whether it's yellow. This is made through a technology or technique called cantilever construction. And I've got a little diagram here trying to show you what cantilever construction does, and that's how falling water works. Those reinforced concrete slabs are made through those bars there. So you can imagine that there are a couple of really large steel rods inside these concrete slabs. So that's what's happening in America. Geometric shapes playing an even stronger role because, remember, we're talking about the avant-garde, and people are still trying to find a universal style, a style that is above the others. And in Holland we have De Stijl, the style. De Stijl seeks to create a balance, a beautiful harmony between opposites. And some of you might recognize this building from the Bourne Identity. Here we have geometric shapes working together in different angles and different sizes, whites and blacks, greens and reds, an equilibrium of opposites, as green is the opposite of red and black the opposite of white. Meanwhile, in Germany, the Bauhaus would ultimately a school, an artistic school, would crank out people following this international style, which focused on craft and an understanding of an international style, seeking for an international style. This would trickle over to the United States. Obviously, as some people tried to flee from the Great War or fled what was happening in Germany at the time, this will become even more so in the next chapter, the fleeing of Germans and intellectuals from Europe to the United States, ultimately changing the center of art in Paris to New York City. But what is a building, though? Some people say a building is a structure. It's simply a structure. That's all it is. Some people say a building can be a home. It's a thing. It lives with you. Corbusier seemed to feel that a building, a home, was a tool, a machine. You work with it. It works with you. When we look at our current home design, we have structures kind of cranked out. 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, this and this and this. But not much thought goes into the experience of living, the experience of using that building with your life. Here, Corbusier reinterprets or redesigns the home to more accommodating choices. And since this is not a history of architecture course, we're not going to go into the super details of the house and what it is, but these changes, these influences are a strong contrast to what's happening. Look at the broad range. Look at the range of what's happening in building. From Cubist-inspired buildings to an international style that focuses on geometric shapes. And we're quickly approaching skyscrapers and high-rise buildings. Whereas before, those buildings were decorated with Renaissance classical attributes or classical facades. Now, because of that international style, glass and steel is simply all you need. Those clean, geometric, symmetrical patterns are universal, no matter the culture, no matter the country. And so now we have the desire for greater, taller, sleeker, shinier buildings. And if you ever make it to the Miracle Mile in Chicago, I would encourage you to take a look at some of those buildings that have been there for, well, some for over 60, 70 years. We finished this chapter presentation with some key terms, and I'd like you to know which ones are really important for understanding. Found object, installation, assemblage, and collage. Those will be used throughout multiple chapters, and they're pretty important to know or understanding outside of even the class. Do you need to know cantilever construction, functionalism, reinforced concrete? Not necessarily, but you definitely need to be aware of assemblage, collage, found object, and installation. As always, if you have any questions, do please let me know either through email, through a call, dropping by the office, or sliding a message under the door or asking questions in class. I hope this helped. I hope it made sense. We have quickly dived into work that is hard to read in the beginning, but if you give it time, think about the context and think about what it's trying to show, you can really learn a lot. Thanks a lot.